In the last chapter of The Borrowers, Arrietty and Pod got back from the borrowing, and Pod knew that she was talking to the boy. And so now they're all concerned about what to do next, because now they've definitely been not just seen, but because of things that she said to the boy that she didn't realize that Pod heard, then he knows that the boy knows exactly where they live. So they're a little concerned about what's going to happen next, and let's see what happens. That night, while Arrietty lay straight and still under her cigar box ceiling, Homily and Pod talked for hours. They talked in the sitting room. They talked in the kitchen. And later, much later, she heard them talk in their bedroom. She heard drawers shutting and opening, doors creaking, and boxes being pulled out from under beds. What are they doing? She wondered. What will happen next? Very still she lay in her soft little bed with her familiar belongings about her, her postage-stamped view of Rio Harbor, her silver pig off a charm bracelet, her turquoise ring, which sometimes, for fun, she would wear as a crown, and dearest of all, her floating ladies with the golden trumpets tooting above their peaceful town. She did not want to lose these, she realized suddenly, lying there, straight and still in bed, but to have all the other things as well, adventure and safety mixed. That's what she wanted. So remember, she kind of likes the fact that the rest of this family, like Hendriri's family, is somewhere else, not trapped in the house. She feels kind of trapped, but at the same time, she really likes having those nice things. So she really wants to have the nice things and feel safe, but still have adventure. Can't have it all. We'll see if she gets it all. And that, the restless bangings and whispers told her, is just what you couldn't do. As it happened, Homily was only fidgeting, opening drawers and shutting them, unable to be still, and she ended up, when Pod was already in bed, by deciding to curl her hair. Now, Homily, Pod protested wearily, lying there in his nightshirt, there's really no call for that. Who's going to see you? Well, that's just it, exclaimed Homily, searching in a drawer for her curl rags. In times like these, one never knows. I'm not going to be caught out, she said irritably, turning the drawer upside down and picking over the spilled contents. With me hair like this? She came to bed at last, looking spiky, like a washed-out gollywog, and Pod, with a sigh, turned over at last and closed his eyes. Homily lay for a long time, staring at the oil lamp. It was the silver cap of a perfume bottle with a tiny floating wick. She felt unwilling, for some reason, to blow it out. There were movements upstairs in the kitchen, and it was late for movements. The household should be asleep, and the lumpy curlers pressed uncomfortably against her neck. She gazed just as Arrietty had done about the familiar room, too full, she realized, with bags and boxes and makeshift cupboards, and thought, what now? Perhaps nothing'll happen after all. The child perhaps is right, and we're making a good deal of fuss about nothing very much, this boy. When all said and done, is only a guess, perhaps, thought Homily. He'll go away again quite soon. And that, she told herself drowsily, will be that. Later, as she realized afterwards, she must have dozed off because it seemed she was crossing Parkin's Beck. It was night, and the wind was blowing, and the field seemed very steep, and she was scrambling up it along the ridge by the gas pipe, sliding and falling in the wet grass. The trees, it seemed to Homily, were thrashing and clashing, their branches waving and sawing against the sky. Then, as she told them many weeks later, there was a sound of splintering wood, and Homily woke up. She saw the room again, and the oil lamp flickering, but something, she knew at once, was different. There was a strange draft, and her mouth felt dry and full of grit. Then she looked up at the ceiling. Pod! She shrieked, clutching his shoulders. Pod rolled over and sat up. They both stared at the ceiling. The whole surface was on a steep slant, and one side of it had come right away from the wall. This was what had caused the draft. And down into the room, to within inches of the foot of the bed, protruded a curious object. A huge bar of gray steel with a flattened, shining edge. "It's a screwdriver," said Pod. They stared at it, fascinated, unable to move, and for a moment all was still. Then, slowly, the huge object swayed upward until the sharp edge lay against their ceiling, and Homily heard a scrape on the floor above, and a sudden human gasp. "Oh, my knee! Oh, my knees!" cried Homily. "Oh, my feeling!" As with a splintering wrench, their whole roof flew off and fell down with a clatter somewhere out of sight. Homily screamed then, but this time it was a real scream, loud and shrill and hearty. She seemed almost to settle down in her scream, while her eyes stared up, half interested, into empty lighted space. There was another ceiling, she realized, away up above them, higher it seemed than the sky. A ham hung from it, and 2 strings of onions. Arrietty appeared in the doorway, scared and trembling, clutching her nightgown, and Pod slapped Homily's back. "Have done," he said. "That's enough." And Homily suddenly was quiet. A great face appeared then between them and that distant height. It wavered above them, smiling and terrible. There was silence, and Homily sat bolt upright, her mouth open. "Is that your mother?" asked a surprised voice after a moment. And Arrietty from the doorway whispered, "Yes." It was the boy. Pod got out of bed and stood beside it, shivering in his nightshirt. "Come on," he said to Homily. "You can't stay there." But Homily could. She had her old nightdress on, with the patch on the back, and nothing was going to move her. A slow anger was rising up in Homily. She had been caught in her hair curlers. Pod had raised his hand to her, and she remembered that, in the general turmoil, and for once in her life she had left the supper washing up for morning. And there it would be, on the kitchen table, for all the world to see. So, Homily's kind of more worried about the fact that the boy's going to see her in her curlers and in her old nightdress, and she didn't clean up from dinner that night. She was going to do it in the morning, so all the dirty dishes are out. It reminds me of my grandma, actually. She glared at the boy. He was only a child, after all. "Put it back," she said. "Put it back at once." Her eyes flashed, and her curlers seemed to quiver. He knelt down then, but Homily did not flinch as the great face came slowly closer. She saw his under lip, pink and full, like an enormous exaggeration of Arrietty's, and she saw it wobble slightly. So he was doing this. He was doing the pouty lip, wasn't he? "But I've got something for you," he said. Homily's expression did not change, and Arrietty called out from her place in the doorway. "What is it?" The boy reached behind him, and very gingerly, carefully to keep it upright, he held a wooden object above their heads. "It's this," he said. And very carefully, his tongue out and breathing heavily, he lowered the object slowly into their hole. It was a doll's dresser, complete with plates. It had two drawers in it and a cupboard below. He adjusted its position at the foot of Homily's bed. Arrietty ran round to see better. "Oh!" she cried ecstatically. "Mother, look!" Homily threw the dresser a glance. It was dark oak, and the plates were hand-painted. And then she looked quickly away again. "Yes," she said coldly, "it's very nice." There was a short silence, which no one knew how to break. The cupboard really opens," said the boy at last, and the great hand came down all amongst them, smelling of bath soap. Arrietty flattened herself against the wall, and Pod exclaimed, nervous, "Now then!" "Yes," agreed Homily after a moment. I see it does. Pod drew a long breath, a sigh of relief as the hand went back. I'm sorry. There, Homily, he said placatingly. You've always wanted something like that. Yes, said Homily. She still sat bolt upright, her hands clasped in her lap. Thank you very much. And now, she went on coldly, will you please put back the roof? Well, wait a minute, pleaded the boy. Again he reached behind him. Again the hand came down, and there beside the dresser, there was barely room for it, was a very small doll's chair. It was a Victorian chair, upholstered in red velvet. Oh! Arrietty exclaimed again, and Pod said shyly, just about fit me, that would. Try it, begged the boy, and Pod threw him a nervous glance. Go on, said Arrietty, and Pod sat down in his nightshirt, his bare feet showing. That's nice, he said after a moment. It would go by the fire in the sitting room, cried Arrietty. It would look lovely on red blotting paper. Well, let's try it, said the boy, and the hand came down again. Pod sprang up just in time to steady the dresser as the red velvet chair was whisked away above his head and placed, presumably, in the next room but one. Arrietty ran out of the door and along the passage to see. Oh, she called out to her parents, come and see, it's lovely. But Pod and Homily did not move. The boy was leaning over them, breathing hard, and they could see the middle buttons of his nightshirts. He seemed to be examining the farther room. I'm sorry, what do you keep in the mustard pot? He asked. Coal, said Arrietty's voice, and I helped to borrow this new carpet. Here's the watch I told you about, and the pictures. I could get you some better stamps than those, the boy said. I've got some Jubilee ones with the Taj Mahal. Look, cried Arrietty's voice again, and Pod took Homily's hand. These are my books. Homily clutched Pod as the great hand came down once more in the direction of Arrietty. Quiet, he whispered. Sit still. The boy, it seemed, was touching the books. What are they called? He asked, and Arrietty reeled off the names. Pod, whispered Homily. I'm gonna scream. No, whispered Pod. You mustn't. Not again. Oh, I feel it coming on, Pod. Pod looked worried. Hold your breath, he said, and count 10. The boy was saying to Arrietty, Why couldn't you read me those? Well, I could, said Arrietty, but I'd rather read something new. But you never come, complained the boy. Oh, I know, said Arrietty. But I will. Pod, whispered Homily, did you hear that? Did you hear what she said? Yes, yes, whispered Pod. Keep quiet. Do you want to see the storerooms? Arrietty suggested next, and Homily clapped a hand to her mouth as though to stifle a cry. Pod looked up at the boy. Hey, he called, trying to attract his attention. The boy looked down. Put the roof back now, Pod begged him, trying to sound matter-of-fact and reasonable. We're getting cold. Well, all right, agreed the boy. But he seemed to hesitate. He reached across them for the piece of board which formed their roof. Shall I nail you down? He asked, and they saw him pick up the hammer. It swayed above them, very dangerous looking. Well, of course, nail us down, said Pod irritably. Well, I mean, said the boy, I got some more things upstairs. Pod looked uncertainly at Homily. Pod looked uncertain, and Homily nudged him. Ask him, she whispered, what kind of things? So even though Homily's frightened to death, she's very interested in those things, isn't she? What kind of things? Asked Pod. The things from an old doll's house there is on the top shelf of the cupboard by the fireplace in the schoolroom. I never seen no doll's house, said Pod. Well, it's in the cupboard, said the boy, right up by the ceiling. You can't see it. You've got to climb on the lower shelves to get to it. Well, what sort of things are there in the doll's house? Asked Arrietty from the sitting room. Oh, everything, the boy told her. Carpets and rugs and beds with mattresses, And there's a bird in a cage. Well, not a real one, of course. And cooking pans, and tables, and 5 gilt chairs. Oh, and a pot with a palm in it. A dish of plaster tarts, and an imitation leg of mutton. Homily leaned across to Pod. "Tell him to nail us down lightly," she whispered. Pod stared at her. Pod turned to the boy. "All right," he said. "You nail us down. But lightly, if you see what I mean. Just a tap or two here and there." So Homily wanted the piece of flooring that he pulled up to get into their house under the floor only nailed in lightly because she'd kind of like him to bring those things back to the house. So right now it kind of looks okay, but we'll see because they've been seen.